Optimal training volume, the worst topic to talk about by far when it comes to social media because, spoiler alert, you'll never know the optimal amount from a piece of paper. Volume is also the topic where people tend to have the most disagreements in the science-based lifting niche. Recently, people are switching back to MRV, which in theory I don't have a problem with since I've been doing it for years, but people don't seem to understand how to incorporate it properly. So even though I've made about 5 videos on this topic already, I'm going to explain all the complex relationships you need to worry about when it comes to volume. It may seem like a lot to implement this, but it's actually quite simple, so you don't need to worry that much. So to recap everything, volume data is really poorly controlled or biased. You can stop to read all this stuff that's highlighted, but basically there's a lot of protocols that don't find any statistical difference in high and low volume regimens. There's also been some studies like the 52 sets a week study that found more growth, but looking at the cases, there's a lot of variation in growth among the volume groups and there are clearly diminishing returns. The new 38 sets a week study is also a little weird with regards to nutrition control and a few other variables highlighted here. Now when we look at this meta-analysis here, strength caps out at around 4 to 6 fractional sets. They count fractional volume in a really weird way, like lat pull downs were 0.5 sets for biceps in this paper, but somehow hypertrophy didn't get maxed out anywhere, which is physiologically impossible. And until we actually get a study that has a clearing point or measures fluid shifts, there's no way to know where this number actually caps out and whether or not they're actually measuring proper hypertrophy. So the reason why a lot of your favorite influencers probably say something like 4 to 10 sets or 2 to 10 is because A, they use strength data as a proxy, or B, they're using previous papers that found 10 to 20 sets to be optimal, but that also counts fractional sets that normally use 1 instead of 0.5, so they cut it in half basically. Proximity to failure is probably the most important thing for muscle growth and training. What happens when you use higher intensities? You can use lower volumes. This is easily explained by the idea of the stimulating reps theory. With higher intensities, muscle can be built with as little as 1 set, but you have to have sufficient frequency as well. You can grow on 1 set 2 times a week, but growing on 3 sets once a week is much harder. More volume will result in more growth, but like I showed in the 52 sets a week study, and in this infographic right here, there's clearly diminishing marginal returns. So onto the topic of MRV, or maximum recoverable volume. In order to train at your MRV, you simply have to get as much hypertrophy as possible while minimizing damage and fatigue, as it will inhibit motor unit recruitment and growth, which basically will decrease the amount of stimulating reps that you can get. This is also partially why 1 to 2 RIR is a similar stimulus in literature as failure. Because of fatigue, you're not always going to be able to get 5 reps or whatever amount of stimulating reps is possible for you. CNS fatigue and peripheral fatigue will also be important to think about. Some studies find that it can take around 3 days to recover from 5 non-failure sets of squats, but it also varies based off the workouts, so I'm going to offer a method to find if your CNS is recovered near the end of the video instead of just trying to approximate it with studies. Peripheral fatigue will vary greatly on the muscle that you're hitting. Recovery times seem to be affected by maximum voluntary activation as well as fiber distribution, but instead of trying to sift through studies to figure out which muscles recover faster or slower, muscles that you use more often in daily life like your calves will probably recover faster. But if you are curious about recovery times for muscles and sequencing based off of that, go watch my free sample upper-lower series. But basically hitting most muscles with a frequency of 2 to 3 will be fine, but above that you'll just have more muscle damage, which will use more resources for growth, which will effectively eliminate the effect of high frequency, which is probably also why 2 to 3 times frequencies don't work with higher volumes. I have a super old video on this meta-analysis that shows this. So to put this all together, in order to push to the maximum recoverable volume for an individual, you'll need to maximize the number of sets that you're doing while limiting CNS fatigue, peripheral fatigue, and muscle damage. The amount of sets that you'll incorporate with training will be extremely individual dependent and be affected by external factors like lifestyle. CNS fatigue, after all, is central nervous system fatigue, so if you have a stressed out or mentally demanding life, you will have a worse ability to perform in the gym. So most people with lives that are at least probably similar to mine won't need more than 1 to 3 direct sets per muscle action per session, with maybe about 12 sets maximum on 2 times frequency splits and 10 sets maximum on 3 times frequency splits, and probably no more than 4 days of training a week. But instead of just blindly following my guidelines, just monitor your training progression. This is why tracking, as hated as it may be at the moment for some weird reason, is very useful. You physically will not be able to tell what your peripheral or CNS fatigue is. So if you are past the point of neural adaptations in your training cycle and keeping the form consistent from week to week, you'll be able to monitor hypertrophy through strength gains. If you are able to do the same load as last week or slightly more with some variation on training level, you are probably recovering well. And if you are feeling good during a session and want to add another set, just go for it. You shouldn't need to feel like you need to ask someone for permission to alter your volume. Now, it is actually okay if your strength decreases a little bit if you're trained and are on a cut, as losing fat will affect your leverage surges, meaning you won't be able to lift as much weight. Although if you are gaining fat too fast, it can possibly give you the illusion of accelerated recovery due to strength gains via leverage. So make sure that you are only pushing the envelope with maximum recoverable volume if you know what you're doing with your sleep and diet. I highly suggest that you work your way up rather than down when it comes to volume. On lower volumes, you will have to focus on execution and making the sets count. If you learn to make them count, which will naturally happen as you become more advanced through motor learning anyway, you'll find you probably don't need as much volume, but it's easier to spot it when you do need more volume. This is why my entry-level free sample splits are set at the lowest volumes possible, so that they can be easily altered to fit your individual needs as they go up and down over time. To wrap things up, here's the objective template on the relationships of frequency, intensity, volume, and training age. Any training can work, but with lower frequencies, you will need to have more volume. Higher intensities, you will need to have less volume, but when you get more advanced, you'll produce more fatigue due to the amount of motor units you have developed. You can think of it as a noob and pro dart player. The noob may need 10 tries to hit a bullseye, while an experienced player will only need 3. These variables should be balanced within your training in order to maximize gains for your given situation. Because not everyone wants to train 4 days a week, not everyone can train for an hour at a time, and not everyone wants to do an upper-lower split or full body. So regardless if you have or don't have an optimal split or schedule, if you manipulate these variables appropriately and monitor sleep, diet, and progression, you'll be fine. The science behind this stuff gets extremely messy, even more so than what the simplified view of this video gave you. But stressing over training volume will do nothing good for you. When you get relatively trained, you can honestly just rely on intuition to manipulate these variables. I personally am not sitting with a spreadsheet opened up to find the R value of my exercises from each of my mesocycles or changes per week, obviously. I don't even train in a standard that is considered optimal by most. I just do what I feel like I want to do for myself. My number one science-based tip for managing training volume is to stop worrying about it. My second tip is to simply manipulate the variables and monitor progression. And my final tip is to understand the intention behind what you're doing as you train. Stop and think, why are you doing whatever volume you are doing for a given exercise, and how much of it is necessary or not?